This is Local Edition. I'm Brad Pomerance in Sacramento. We are joined by Senator George Runner. He is a member of the Board of Equalization, the vice chair of that body. And so I'd like to speak with you, if we may, about the budget.
Sure.
The governor recently issued his proposed budget, the January budget. And I find this governor fascinating. Some call him the best Republican governor we've had in decades. And I was reading the press releases that came out of the legislature, and the Democrats were kind of hemming and hawing about the budget, and the Republicans were hemming and hawing, but less. Seems like they like the budget better than the Democrats.
You know, oftentimes, particularly when there's a lot of money on the table, and certainly this year is a year that there's some extra revenues, it oftentimes becomes a push and pull with the governor, even of the same party. And particularly for Democrats. I can remember when I was, a number of years ago, I was vice chair of budget in the Assembly. When Gray Davis was governor.
Got it. A Democrat, you're a Republican.
A Republican. And I remember going down and meeting with the Governor Davis early in the process, about this time, and him saying, you know, I'm going to be the best friend for Republicans. Unfortunately, in that setting, it didn't turn out that way, because if you remember kind of what Governor Davis's problem was, he basically got pushed around by the Democrat legislature. And then the spending went really high and all that, and ultimately ended up in his recall. I think he would have been a stronger governor if he would have just stayed on focus with his control ability as governor. This governor seems to be, I think, a little stronger and a little less intimidated by the legislature. So I think it's normal posturing. Of course, the governor postures himself in two different ways. Number one, he postures himself with spending. And he also postures himself by how much revenue he thinks is going to come in.
And I want to talk about that. Let's talk about the revenue that's going to come in. He will provide projections from his Department of Finance. The legislative analysts will provide projections. And the projections are usually different. The governors are usually more conservative than the legislative analysts, but the legislative analyst is usually accurate, meaning there's got to be more than what the governor says.
And then the legislature gets in there and says, well, we think they're pretty conservative too. And they'll come up with a whole nother number in regards to what they think they can take spending to. So yeah, I mean, that's really the push and pull that you get in there. You know, the things that the governor was saying, the good things the governor was saying that makes sense for California right now is, number one, he's wanting to put money away from the rainy day fund.
We'll talk about that, yes.
Really important, because we know we have economic cycles. And so being prepared for that. The second thing is he's interested in looking at one-time expenses.
And I want to break those out, if I may. Let's go back, though, to the projections. On the projection side, what is stunning in many ways is that, at least in past cycles, he has insisted that his projections be the projections that be used. And the Democrats have said, okay.
Well, because ultimately, remember what he's got the ability to do. Is when they send him a budget, he can veto the budget.
He can.
So ultimately, he's got the control.
And then I want to talk about, like you said, these surpluses. So what his Democratic friends are saying is, we have these surpluses, more than even you said we'd have, so let's try to restore cuts from prior years, adopt certain programs. But what he has said is, absolutely not. If we have surpluses, we can use them for one-time spending. It could be to pay down debt.
Which is exactly what we didn't do with Gray Davis.
I see.
At that point, what happened is there was revenues that were coming in at that time, and instead of being conservative and spending that money on one-time events, whether they be water issues or whether they be road issues or schools for that matter, construction, they chose to go ahead and put those into ongoing expenses, so that then when the cycle came back and all of a sudden revenues weren't coming in, they had built the base up to such a point that we created these large deficits. That's what this governor's wanting to avoid.
So at this stage, with these surpluses, we are paying down debt. Could the governor, with Republican help or otherwise, look towards one-time expenditures for a one-time program, maybe roads?
I mean, that's usually what it is. It's going to be capital expenses. You know, that's what you're going to get into, and that makes sense.
But has he been doing that?
Well, I think it's a pretty big leap. I think it would be interesting for him. I think he is doing that. Actually, there's some one-time expenses for state buildings. In this budget, which again makes sense. You've got buildings that are really in ill repair, and it makes sense to go ahead and use one-time money to get those in shape. The other issue though the big issue that is on the table that the legislature is struggling with right now, and the governor, and that is transportation issues. So, and at the same time, they've got this transportation bond, which then borrows money to do construction into the future. Well, if you've got additional surplus right now, why not use that money and not borrow the money? It puts you in a better position in the future. And that way, when the cycle of less revenue comes in, you just stop doing those expenses.
You mentioned the rainy day fund. In the governor's proposed January budget, he's looking to put $2 billion more into the rainy day fund, getting closer to full funding. Do you think it's appropriate for him to do that? Should he be putting in more or less, or did he hit the sweet spot?
Well, I think, I think putting more is the right direction. If he was to put in more money, if he was to put in, say, I would not be too critical if indeed not putting all the money into rainy day fund and putting money into, for instance, transportation. Those kind of capital expenses make sense to me too. I think there's not a lot of folks who feel like in the next year or two we're going to go back into a tough economic cycle. So I think you can use these next couple of years in planning to fully fund the rainy day fund.
Let me ask you about Proposition 30. That passed in 2012. It increased sales tax for 4 years. It also increased a tax on the wealthiest among
Income
us
tax.
for 7 years.
Right.
So the 4 years is coming up.
Yes.
The governor has said, absolutely not. I will not sign on to an extension of that sales tax extension.
What a concept. A governor who's saying, I'm willing to go ahead and back up the temporary tax
that I pushed.
That we pushed and said was necessary.
There is, though, the issue of the tax on the wealthiest, the income tax. So that's not expiring for another 3 years. But there are folks that are looking to put on the ballot an extension of that tax. What I find most interesting, and also exempted from the state rainy day fund.
Well, again, these are folks who want to basically spend every last dime. And rather than having the spenders in the legislature, or the spenders in terms of those who are getting money from the budget, their view is the backup when we have hard times fiscally. The backup isn't, oh, let's go to our rainy day fund. The backup is, let's go back to taxpayers. They always feel like there's a resource out there when it's tough to go back to taxpayers, and that's what's that just isn't right and fair.
It just seems odd to me when the state rainy day fund seems to be wildly popular. And it seems odd that the proponents of extending part of Prop 30 would want to exempt. It just seems like electoral suicide. I don't know. Well, who am I to say?
Makes it much tougher. Well, I think the whole sell is tough. I think it's a tough sell to go to voters this year and say, hey, look, remember that temporary tax we told you about? We want to go ahead and make it a permanent tax.
And exclude it from rainy day fund.
For this. And on top of that, you know what? We've got several $1 billion extra money that we're doing new programs with. It seems like a really tough sell in this environment.
We're also looking at a potential school construction bond. I feel as if there may be some bipartisan support for it. Are Republicans on board?
I think they could be.
Yeah.
I think they could be.
But the governor isn't so much on board. At this stage.
I think at this stage he isn't. I think there's a lot of concern there. And of course, you get school bond coming from different directions. There was an effort in the legislature to do a school bond that failed. And now you've got an initiative out there to put a school bond on.
I think $9 billion.
That's coming, I think, mostly from builders and those folks that they're feeling it. So it's a push and pull.
What's your sense?
I sense that you've got to. The fact is that in the way California operates, we build schools with borrowed money. And if you're running, and there are a lot of schools that probably need to be looked at, and how do we then replace these schools? How do we build schools? I think it's a good issue. The problem is, I think if the legislature does it, what you do is you don't get a lot of reform then in the construction process. If you go ahead and let some outside folks come up with a formula, I think you get more reform in the construction process, therefore lowering the cost for the
I think
schools.
the governor's looking for that type of reform. So we'll see what happens. Okay, his name is George Runner. He is a member of the Board of Equalization, the vice chair of that organization. My name is Brad Pomerance in Sacramento. This is Local Edition.